All right, hey everybody, welcome to today's webinar. We're just going to wait a minute or two to get started, give people a chance to join, so just hang tight and we will get started here in a minute. All right, hey everybody, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Scott Klein. I'm a senior consultant here at SSG. I'd like to introduce Randy Knight, founder of SQL Solutions Group. He's going to be talking about SQL Server Migration. He's been working on this for a while, so this should be really good, and we've got a lot of good information. So I'm going to mute myself and turn the time over to Randy Knight. Randy, the floor is yours.
All right, well, good to be here and get started. This is a follow-up to a webinar from 2 months ago, I believe, in December. In that webinar, we talked about preparing for a migration or assessing a migration using the database migration assistant that Microsoft provided. Today, we're going to start there. We'll do a little bit of review of that just to kind of talk about things that we need to be thinking about when we do a migration. And then we're going to jump into actually performing a migration using the dbatools PowerShell module. So should be fun. Put on your seatbelts. It's gonna be good. All right, just a little bit about SSG. You have to put up with this in every free webinar, I think. We are a Microsoft partner. We've been in business for 10 years, and we focus exclusively on the Microsoft data platform. I myself have been doing SQL Server since version 6.5, so 25 years or so, somewhere in that neighborhood. And most of our folks have similar experience. Our business offerings are primarily, we have 3, or I guess you could say 4 different areas. We of course do project consulting, billable hours. That's our bread and butter as a so-called boutique consulting company. We also have a remote DBA managed service, which is becoming a bigger and bigger part of our business. So if you don't have a DBA, or maybe you're the DBA and you need some help, or you want to focus on things that are core to your business and let us take care of the operations, take a look at that. We also do health checks, which is a great starting point to kind of give us a baseline. And we have a coaching program. So if you want to have us do it with you, so to speak, we'll sit and work with you in your environment, on your problems, on your things. That's why we don't call it training, it's coaching. All right, myself, I am a Microsoft Certified Master, if you happen to know what that means. Again, been working with SQL Server since '97 or so exclusively. Prior to that, I was working with databases and was a network admin and some different things. but got into my DBA career, let's say in 1997. So been doing this for a long time. I've done a lot of things in my career prior to starting this company. One of the most interesting and most, I guess, noteworthy in terms of things people would understand, I spent 6 years as a DBA database engineer and then an architect for Match.com, which was super fun. I always say that's the most interesting data that I've had to work with. A lot better than, you know, healthcare or finance or whatever else that we might be working with. So, and I'm the founder and principal consultant of SQL Solutions Group. So let's get started. What we're going to do today is we're going to do a quick review. So if you were in the December webinar, some of this will be review for you. We're going to talk about some of the same things, but we'll go through it quicker this time because what we really want to get to is the actual migration and the DBA tools PowerShell module. So we'll look at the types of migrations you might be doing. What are some of the common challenges that you run into, do's and don'ts. Talk about what needs migrating. A lot of times we think of our SQL Server as just databases. And oh, again, we need logins, right? We need our databases and we need to get access to those databases. And what we talked about in December is that if you perform a migration with the DMA, Database Migration Assistant, that's all it moves, is databases and logins. And that's great if that's all you're using, but there's a lot more that goes on a SQL Server. We want to make sure that we capture everything that we need. We're going to do a quick review of compatibility levels when you are upgrading in a migration, because that's a critical piece that gets missed quite often. And then, of course, we're going to spend the bulk of the time in the demos and just in PowerShell using DBA tools to perform a migration. So with all that, let's get started. Migration types. On-premise. This is, I think, still the most common type of migration that we see. People, you know, you might be doing a version upgrade would be the most common, right? You've got an old 2012 or even, you know, there's a lot of folks who still have some 2008 R2 servers that need to be upgraded. It could be a consolidation, right? Perhaps you're putting together a database as a service or SQL as a service, private cloud type of thing. You're consolidating from all your servers. We've done a lot of this work in the past, not so much lately. People seem to have gotten a handle on it, but you know, just one story. One company that I did a consolidation project for, when we scanned the environment to find all the SQL servers, there were over 600 instances found. They told me they had 30. Okay, so consolidation is a separate topic, but it's something that's pretty important. All right, could be new hardware. You're moving to new infrastructure. In the days of virtual machines, Hyper-V, VMware, we don't see as much of this because if you're on a VM, we're upgrading the host, we're upgrading the infrastructure behind the scenes, and we just live migrate or move the VM to the new host. But that does happen still occasionally. Or we could be migrating to the cloud. And when we talk about the cloud, there's two types of cloud ways to run your databases. There's what we call infrastructure as a service, which is SQL Server, the on-premise version of SQL Server running on a cloud-based virtual machine. So whether it's Azure, Amazon Web Services, Google, you know, there's a lot of cloud providers out there, a lot of smaller ones. But at the end of the day, it's a virtual machine. I like to say, you know, if you're doing IaaS, infrastructure as a service, really you're just extending your data center to the cloud, so to speak, and you know, getting out of the hardware business, right, is essentially what you're doing. But for all intents and purposes, for what we do as DBAs, it's not very different than an on-premise migration. Platform as a service would be things like Azure SQL Database, Synapse Analytics, Amazon's RDS, whatever it may be where you're not actually hosting an operating system, the cloud provider is taking care of that for you. We talked about that in the December webinar. That's not a topic for today because what we're talking about is migrating the on-premise version of SQL Server using DBA tools. So if you're migrating to a platform as a service based system, that would be an entirely different way of doing that migration. And if there's interest, we could do a webinar on that at some point. Okay, what are some of the challenges that we run into when we migrate? In many environments, I would probably go so far as to say most environments in terms of what we see. Of course, I always tell people that, you know, what we see are people that need help. And so, you know, it may be a little bit of a skewed view of what's out there. But in many, many environments, you know, we've got SQL servers out there that have been around for years. There's been turnover in personnel. And, you know, we know that this server does functions A, B, and C, but there could be D, E, F, X, J. I mean, all kinds of things going on there that we don't know about. So that's one of the things that we, you know, if we're going to decommission a server, we've got to make sure that we captured everything that we're using it for. What's going to break? That's related to the first one, right? But that's one of the big fears sometimes that people have, leadership, management, that, you know, every time we do something like this, we break something. And that's a function of that first thing that we're, you know, we're not well documented. We don't really kind of understand our environment. What's the risk, reward, or cost benefit of doing this? And what I find is that these four things, especially the first two, ultimately end up in fear, right? We don't like doing this because our production databases are so critical to our business. And every time we do this, we miss something, something breaks. It might be something that, you know, it runs once a year. And so we put it off, right? And many times that's because of those next two as well. You know, we don't see the ROI. And this results in some really old SQL servers being out there. Like I said, SQL Server 2008 R2 went end of extended support last year, and there's still a lot out there. And when we talk to people, they say, yeah, we need to get that taken care of, but they always have other projects that are more important. And we have SQL 2012, which goes end of mainstream support, at least I believe next year. And so we need to be preparing for these things. The other thing I tell people when they say, hey, what version should we upgrade to? I would go as recent as you can, simply because people don't like to upgrade their database servers very often. So if you go from 2012 to 2014 or 2016, you're going to have to do it again sooner, as opposed to going to 17 or 19. So what are the things we want to make sure that we do when we do a migration? We want to use the opportunity to clean up the environment. You know, a lot of people just say, we just want to move everything. You know, sometimes they'll want to do an in-place upgrade, or, you know, even just like a P to V and then do an in-place upgrade types of things, because we believe that that's going to be cleaner and we're not going to worry about those things. What's going to break? What do we have? In my experience, in-place upgrades cause more problems than they're worth. And this is a good opportunity to clean up your environment, right? Maybe your old server's not configured according to best practices. So when we build this new server that we're going to migrate to, let's make sure we do that. Maybe we have unused databases, old jobs, logins for people that are no longer at the company, that have been disabled, whatever the case may be. Hopefully they've been disabled. You know, let's take the opportunity as we're doing the analysis portion of this project to figure out what do we actually need, right? And then the rest of it, you know, keep a backup, right? Archive those databases, backups of those databases, and start with a much cleaner, more modern environment. It's a great opportunity to harden your security, at least at the SQL Server instance and operating system level. You know, we see things like SQL servers that were installed and we weren't sure what it needed, so we made the service account a local administrator. Or I've even seen domain admins service accounts, which is not necessary. So, you know, we want to follow the principle of least privilege, right? What do we have to have? We also need to make sure that we treat this as a project. Analysis, what do we have? What are we migrating? What are the gotchas? All these things. Design, we want a tested, well thought out plan. One of the great things about doing this with DBA tools is that this can really come down to one click to do your production migration, which is just running a script. And then implementation. And a lot of times in the infrastructure side of the house, we're not as used to this, right? In the development side of the house, engineering teams from who are building software tend to do this, you know, whether it's old school, you know, waterfall, or whether it's agile, whatever the case may be. Most of the time, not always, we avoid what's called whiskey, which is why isn't somebody coding yet, right? And we skip the requirements. And we have projects like that with customers who don't spend the time on requirements, and it becomes this kind of iterative mess that, you know, and you deploy it and people are like, oh, well, we forgot we needed to do this, or we didn't think of this. And you end up, you know, with software or whatever it is that you're building that's, you know, less optimal than whatever you have. And then test, right? What's great about the world of virtual machines is we can prepare our target server that we're going to migrate to. We can grab a snapshot, checkpoint if it's a Hyper-V, and we can test our migration. And then we can roll back to that base and we can test it again. And we can do this over and over again until we've covered everything. And then we do one more rollback to that snapshot. We do our migration. And then of course, once we're live and we know we're good, we're going to delete the snapshot because it's really not a good idea to leave snapshots or checkpoints lying around for SQL servers because it can have a significant impact on I/O. What do we want to avoid? Don't install unnecessary components. I can't tell you how many times I come across a SQL server that has everything, right? Reporting services, analysis services, integration services, master data management, replication. I mean, if you look at the installer, when you get to that point where you choose the features, every single one was chosen, right? So what that does is, A, don't assume that you're using it because it's installed and install it on the new environment, but you also can't assume that you're not using it. So that's part of your assessment, is to figure out what you actually need. As I mentioned before, we advocate avoiding in-place upgrades. You're bringing along a lot of stuff with you that you probably don't need to. It's also, you know, if you're doing an in-place upgrade, you have to do the whole thing, you know, during a maintenance window versus just a cutover. It impacts testing, right? So it's just best practice to, and in the world of virtual machines, this is easier to do, right? Because we create a new virtual machine as our target to migrate to. We do all of our testing on it. We finally migrate to it live, and we shut down the old virtual machine. We're not even using any additional resources other than during that interim while we're running both of them. And if you're resource constrained, what you can do is give that target VM less resources than it will have in production during that entire testing process. And, you know, when you actually do the live migration, give it the resource that it needs. I don't like when people want to move system databases, master model MSDB. You know, it can be done. And, you know, your MSDB, that brings all of your SQL Server agent stuff. If your master will bring your logins and all your databases, it can be done, but I find it's one of those things that we just bring along a lot of our problems with us. So unless you're, know that your system is really clean, I don't like restoring system databases. And one of the things that's great about dbatools is that it makes it just as easy to just copy those things from all those places to the new system versus backup and restore of system databases. Okay, what are the things that we need to think about migrating? There's a list of common items that I have here, and then some less common, and this is just based upon what we see. There's the obvious ones. We have databases, we have logins, we have all of our SQL Server agent objects, jobs, alerts, operators, so forth. We may have credentials. This is less common, but they do exist. If you're using, most common use of a credential is when you have a proxy set up for your SQL agent jobs, you have to have a credential associated with that. Database mail. So if you're using database mail, which most are, if only for SQL agent notifications, you need to get that configuration set up on the new server. If you're using replication, you're going to have an impact there. Extended event sessions. Now today we're going to use a 2008 R2 instance as our source. So we obviously don't have extended events there, but you may have some sessions that you've set up that are running regularly or that you just have in place so that if you need to diagnose something, you can kick that off. So we want to get those extended event templates and sessions moved over. Linked servers. Linked servers are quite common. In some cases, I feel like they're used too much or used in ways that they don't perform the best, but they do exist. So we need to make sure we have that. With linked servers, and with many of these things, but particularly linked servers, we need to make sure that we have the new server configured for the things that we need. And what I mean by that is if your linked servers are all just going to other SQL servers, great. But if you have a linked server to a Oracle environment or a Postgres environment or an Excel spreadsheet and Access, I mean, you can have linked servers to lots of things. Active Directory, right? Well, you need to make sure in your new environment that those all work, that you have the right drivers installed and the right things configured for your linked servers, which comes back to that testing, right? Migrate your linked servers and test and try to use them and see what breaks. We can also migrate all of our sys configurations, the things that we set up with spconfigure or that are in the sys.configurations dynamic management view. You want to be careful with this. This is a place where some of those configurations are legacy, let's call them, that we may not have looked at recently. Things that come into mind for that are things like parallelism, max degree of parallelism, cost threshold of parallelism, things like optimize for ad hoc queries, although that is a best practice we recommend turning on in today's environment. Just because there's so much use of things like entity framework where most queries are ad hoc queries. But we want to be careful to make sure that we have analyzed that and are these configurations right for the new environment, particularly things like the parallelism settings, max memory. Your new server may have more or less memory, it may have fewer or more CPUs. So it's a good idea to look at your configurations and decide if you're going to copy them, but we just want to think about that carefully. Okay, some of the less common things that we need to migrate. Instance level triggers. You can have triggers at the instance level or sometimes called system triggers, right? We want to make sure we capture those. If you are using SQL Server auditing and you have server audits, you need to make sure you get the audits and the audit specifications moved over. If you happen to be using the built-in maintenance plans, most are not using these. We don't use them for our customers. But if you're using the built-in maintenance plans, you need to make sure that you get those copied over. Endpoints. User objects in the system databases. Now, this is something that we recommend not ever doing, right? So even for things like maintenance plans, so we use Ola Hallengren's open source maintenance plans in our environments, but we create a separate database to put those objects in, right? But don't assume because that's a best practice that nobody has ever created an object in the master database or created some things in model to, so that all databases that they create have those objects. So we want to make sure that we don't neglect that. Other features that you might be using in SQL Server, things like policy-based management, resource governor, change data capture, the data collectors for the performance data warehouse. There's a lot of different things that you might be using, so you want to make sure that you capture everything. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about here before we jump into DBA tools is compatibility levels. Compatibility levels exist at the database level on your server. So every database in its database options will have a compatibility level that looks like this, 150, 140, 100, like that. Those map to SQL Server versions. When you migrate a database to an up-level version of SQL Server, the compatibility level is not changed by default. And for good reason, because there may be deprecated features in the T-SQL language that are no longer supported. Also be aware the compatibility level only applies to T-SQL, right? A lot of people believe that, if I have the compatibility level set to a certain one, that database is going to act just like it was on a 2016 instance if I'm at 130, for example. That is incorrect. It's just the T-SQL. And most of the time when people run into this is when they've upgraded and they want to use some new feature and it doesn't work because we have to change the compatibility level. What happens though is because that does not happen automatically, it often gets neglected. So when we were in the throes of SQL Server 2008 R2 upgrades, when it was going end of life and lots of people were doing that, we had multiple cases where people had databases that had been around for so long, they were in compatibility level 80, SQL Server 2000. Well, if you go over to the far right column and you look at the supported compatibility level, what's the last version of SQL Server that supports 80? SQL Server 2008 R2. So now, before we can even upgrade, even to 2012, much less 2019, we have to go through that process of regression testing and making sure our applications work completely with a new compatibility level. So it's one that it's best to do on each upgrade so that you know what you're going to have and be aware of what's supported. But most importantly, just be aware of it because a lot of people don't think about compatibility level when they move databases to a new version of SQL Server. Okay, DBA tools. DBA tools is a community PowerShell module that has been around for a few years now. I can't remember exactly when it started, but it is an absolute game changer. I tell people, I'll get to this, but as of the last build, last time I upgraded the module, there were 600 commands, right? And what this does is automate a lot of the tedious tasks and things that you have to do as a DBA. It's an absolute game changer. What I tell people is this: a lot of DBAs have really, kind of dug in their heels or just haven't taken the opportunity to learn PowerShell. I'm a DBA, I don't need to learn PowerShell, I do everything in T-SQL. If DBA tools is your only reason to learn PowerShell, you should learn PowerShell. It's a little bit hyperbolic, but DBA tools will change your life, at least your work life. It makes it much easier. On the Slack channel for DBA tools a couple of weeks ago, someone said something like, you know, it feels like cheating, right? Because it just is so helpful to you. All right, so there's 600 commands in DBA tools. How do we go about figuring out what we're going to use? This PowerShell right here is something that I use a lot, not just with DBA tools. If you say get command and specify the specific module, it will give you all of the commands. Well, if you pipe that to out Gridview and you get your Gridview, now you can sort, you can filter, you can, you know, if you use pass-through, you can select a command that you want to use. It's an easy way to figure out what's available. The DBA tools is at dbatools.io. The documentation link goes to docs.dbatools.io. It has them all listed. The documentation is fantastic in terms of all the parameters, examples. And one of the best things is it has a link at the bottom of every command to the source code on GitHub. So it's a great way actually to learn PowerShell, right? Or to understand what they're doing. A lot of times, you know, if we're going to bring in an open source command to do something for us, we want to understand under the hood what it's doing, right? So looking at that source code is a great way to do that. Okay, what are some of the things in DBA tools that we can migrate? Databases, logins, database mail, credentials, all of our SQL agent jobs, alerts, operators, as well as our agent properties that we may have set, link servers. If you are using a central management server, it will migrate that configuration to your new server. Anything in your sys configurations can be copied over. It looks for user objects in system databases, instance level triggers, backup devices. You know, this is pretty darn legacy. Not a lot of people are using defined devices anymore, but if you are using them, it will grab them. Audits, audit specifications, endpoints, extended event, policy-based management, resource governor. If you're using any custom error messages that you've added, data collection sets, startup procedures. It's a pretty exhaustive list of the things that you're going to need. All right, with that, we're going to jump into the demo, and that's going to be the bulk of the rest of this webinar is hands-on, or at least watching me be hands-on. So we're going to look at DBA tools. We're going to review some of the migration-related commands, and we're going to migrate from a 2008 R2 server to a 2019 server in one click. How cool is that? All right, let's switch over now first to SQL Server Management Studio and take a look at our two instances. We have one called Demo SQL 2K8 R2. We can see here that's a SQL Server 2008 R2 instance. If we look at the databases, it just has a few databases: AdventureWorks, AdventureWorks DW, SSG, that's the database that I mentioned that we use for maintenance plans and things like that. If we look at security, we've got quite a few logins, both Windows logins and standard logins. We have, if we go to management, we have database mail configured. So if I take a look at my database mail, and I look at profiles, for example, we can see I have this one default profile that uses this account. I could, of course, have multiple profiles in a real production environment. And finally, SQL Server Agent. We have, now this is kind of a default instance for demos, so it doesn't have a lot going on. These are mostly maintenance jobs, but we do have all these jobs. We have some standard alerts set up. We have a DBA operator set up that gets notifications for those jobs and alerts. We don't have a proxy, but if we did, it would grab those. So we have a server with a variety of things that we need to make sure get brought over. All right, our destination server is SQL 2019, which we can see in the build here, right? It has no databases. It has one login. Actually, it has the local administrator, the built-in stuff, and myself, right? The SQL Server agent, there's nothing there, right? There's no jobs, no alerts, no operators. It's a brand spanking new instance. It's been configured, for best practices like we do for all new servers. But it's pretty much an empty SQL Server for us to migrate to. All right, let's switch over to PowerShell and take a look at dbatools. And actually, before we do that, I'm going to go to dbatools and just take a look at the website, dbatools.io. I love this front page. PowerShell loves SQL Server. We were joking that it's appropriate for this month's webinar since it's just past Valentine's Day. So that's our Valentine's Day piece of this. But it's all open source, community driven, fantastic resource. If I go to the commands, this is a command index, and this does the same thing as docs in that it lists all of the commands, or most of them. I find that docs is a little bit more up to date sometimes than commands, but it categorizes them. So if I go to migration, for example, we see all of these copy commands. So these are all of those commands that will copy objects from one server to another. There's also start Dba Migration, which is nothing more than a wrapper for these commands. Using start Dba Migration has pros and cons. It makes it easy because it grabs all those things that you might want, but it's less flexible. There's a lot of parameters for some of these individual commands that are not supported in start Dba Migration. That said, we're going to use this today, but we'll also look at some of the copy commands as well. So one of the things that I can see here is that pretty much all of the migration related commands start with the verb copy. So thinking about my trick of, how do I figure out what commands are available? That makes that really easy. I just look for that verb, okay? All right, going to docs. If we have our list of every command and we can search. So let me say start DBA, and there's my start DBA migration. If I click on that, as I said, the documentation is really good. One of the things that's great about this is it shows you right here in the description all of the things that will be migrated by default. You can also use the exclude parameter to skip certain things. So maybe you're not using it, and so why bother trying to move it? Or perhaps it's something that you need those parameters that are more flexible for that particular thing. So I'm going to use copy DBA login to copy my login, so I'm going to exclude logins in DBA migration. Lots of good examples. All of the commands in dbatools are this way. It's very, very well supported. Here's all the things that you can exclude. And then I wanted to show you at the end here, one of the best things about the dbatools docs, and that is there's a link right to the source code on GitHub. So if I go to start Dba Migration, there's my function. So if I go through here, there's the description of all the things that it does. But when I go down to the code, what I will see is, there's a lot of these things that are kind of just, error checking and things like that, make sure the parameters are checked or are provided the way they should be. But then we get down to where it starts to do the work and take a look at what it's doing. Copy DBA, SP configure, copy DBA, custom error, credential, DB mail, reg server. So as I said, DBA migration is a wrapper for all of these other commands, right? Copy database, copy login, update database ownership, link servers, data collectors, audits at the instance level, so forth. And that's true of all of these commands. All right, having looked at that, let's jump into PowerShell and take a look at this. And I'll make that a little bit more visible. So the first thing I'm doing is I've got my source instance and my destination instance variables. I also have a couple of commands here so that I can roll back my VM checkpoint so that we could run this multiple times. We know that it's starting fresh because we just looked at it, so we don't need to run those right now. And then I have a hash table, which is called splat. Using hash tables for parameters in PowerShell is called splatting. So I'm very original with my variable names. These are all parameters to start DBA migration. And the way this works is you set the parameters in this hash table, and then in your actual command, you just say start DBA migration @ as opposed to $ hash table name, and it will grab all of those. And it's just a little bit cleaner. You know, if I said start DBA migration and went to set my parameters, it just gets kind of verbose, right? And then, you know, then I end up doing things like, okay, I want a parameter on each line, so I have to put my line ending character. And you know, it's just a little bit cleaner in my experience to use hash tables if there's a lot of parameters. All right, so let's talk about what those parameters are. Source and destination, that's pretty obvious. For copying your databases, there are two methods that are supported by Start DBA Migration, or really by Copy DBA Database, because that's what's doing the actual migration. Backup restore, we're going to back up the database on the source, we're going to restore it on the destination. Or detach attach, we're going to detach the databases, we're going to copy the MDF, NDF, LDF files to the new server, we're going to attach them. There's also an option if we do that we can then reattach them on the source server if we so choose. I tend to always try to use backup restore simply because this one requires an outage. Detach attach requires an outage on the source, and we want to avoid that. The other thing I didn't mention earlier, this method for migration it is about I guess what I would say smaller servers or normal sized databases. If you have a VLDB, you know, in the multi-terabyte range database, you're going to need to migrate that in a very different way, right? Because, you know, you're not going to back up several terabytes, restore them, you know, during an outage. And so we usually end up doing things like setting up log shipping so that when we cut over to our production go live, all we have to do is restore log shipping, and typically, you know, we'll take the databases offline or at least set them read-only on the source instance, and that's all that it takes. Backup restore specific parameters. If you're using backup restore, you need to specify a shared path. This is where it's going to put the backups. So this path has to, both servers have to be able to read and write to that share. And by servers, I mean the SQL Server service account, right? Because we're going to back up to this share on the source, and we're going to restore from this share on the destination. I can say, you know, do I want with replace? I have that set to true so that if I happen to have some of these databases, or I've done some testing and I forgot to roll back, it will replace them. No recovery. If I was creating a standby server, we can say reuse the source folder structure if we know that our volumes and paths and everything on the new server are the same. If not, it's going to restore into the default locations that are configured on your instance. We also can say use last backup. So it can just go on the source and say, when's the last backup? And it will grab full diff, all the logs, it'll restore from that location. again, assuming that your destination has access to the path that those backups are stored. All right, and you can see from my parameters, we're using backup restore. We have a shared path with replace, with recovery. In other words, no recovery equals false. We're not using the folder structure, and we're not using the last backup. Okay. This next set of parameters is set source read only. I've got that set to false right now. I'm going to set that to true. For my SQL agent jobs, do I want to disable my jobs on the destination or the source? So this is set up right now as if this was my go live migration, right? Disable, or no, I'm sorry, a test migration. Disable jobs on destination is true, disable on source equals false. That way I can copy all the jobs, I can check them out, I can do what I need to do. I could even run them manually if I need to, but they're not going to just start kicking off until I'm ready for them to. When I did my production migration, I would flip those. Disable on the source, set the source read only, and typically I will go ahead and leave them disabled on the destination so I can give it a once over before they just start running, but we could set that to true. All right, and then there's some commands here on behavior. Force equals true means if the object exists on the destination, it will drop it and recreate it. Verbose just means that it's going to give me more verbose output, which we want to see for the purposes of this demo. And I've got some excludes just to show how that works. This is an array of strings, and they are specific words that you have to use. So if I say exclude, there's my list of all the things that I can exclude. And what I did is I excluded things that I know that we don't have in our source instance, just to show how that works. Do I want to keep change data capture? Do I want to keep replication? We don't have either of those things, so I have those set to false. So what we're going to do, we're going to execute that so we have our variables. We're going to set all of our parameters. And with any luck, I won't have a Bill Gates experience demoing Windows 95 and blue screening right here. We're going to kick this off. And these are small databases, small server for these purposes. This is only going to take about 5 minutes. So we're going to kick this off. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to a different PowerShell session, and we're going to look at some of the other commands and how I would use those to kind of customize what we're doing. So with no further discussion, off we go. All right. What we're going to see in the output here is it's just going through. We have verbose output turned on. So there's our SP configures. There's the credential. Again, it's going to go through all of these things: database mail, database accounts, databases, right? So now it's starting the copy DBA database command. All right, while that's running, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to open a new PowerShell tab. And I've got another script here where I have my source and destination instance. And we're just going to look at some of these things that we've talked about in the ways that, you know, start DBA migration is going to migrate all logins, all databases, for example, right? So first thing I want to show you is that trick with get command. And if I run get command without module, it'll give me every command that's available on my system. We don't want that. So we're going to say module dbatools. And one of my favorite commandlets is Gridview. So if I execute that, it's going to pop up this grid right here with all of those commands. And I can sort by any of these columns. But if I say copy up here, for example, in my criteria, in my filter, there's all of my copy ones, right? Or I could do it a different way and I say, I want everything that has to do with a database. Attach, detach, there's some AG database commands, backup, copy database, dismount database, find a database, remove a database, right? It's very easy to find your commands using this technique. In fact, I use that so much that I have a function in my PowerShell profile called dbat. So all I have to do is hit dbat, and there's my list. So your mileage may vary on that. All right, the thing I wanted to look at here were logins. We're going to use a command called get DBA login, and the SQL instance will be the source. So let's run that and get a list of all of our logins. So here's all of our logins on the source, right? The next thing I'm going to show you is using that same thing with the grid view, but with the pass-through parameter set. What that does is it allows me to select things in my grid view, and I'll get a collection of those things in my variable. So I'm setting a variable called logins. So let's go ahead and execute that. And I've got my list of all the logins. And maybe I just want to copy my standard logins. We're in a different domain or something, so we got to handle those differently. So I select those and I say okay. And now if we look at my logins, what I have is a collection of those logins that I chose, right? And then what I could do is call the copy DBA login, source, destination. The login parameter is actually a string, or is an array. So I can just pass that collection of logins here. I'm also using force, which means it will drop and recreate the login, and kill active connection. So specifying specific logins and kill active connection are two examples of parameters that don't exist in Start Dba Migration, right? So if I wanted to do something like this, I would exclude logins from Dba Migration, and I would do a copy Dba login like this. And really what I would do for a specific migration is I would make a list of logins, right? Maybe it's a text file that I read them from or whatever. I don't want to, when I go to do a production migration, I want it to be one click like I did in the other window, right? I don't want to have to do anything that could be an error. All right, let's go back and look at our migration. And it looks like we had some errors. So let's take a look. Oh, it's saying that my server required a restart for some of these things. Or no, these are configurations. So it's just saying I need to restart in order to apply those. There's a failed to restore database for this SSG database for some reason. So we would need to look at that. It skipped my login, which is good. It skipped the built-in logins. It created a user schema in MSDB that was set up. It copied the alerts, all of those things, right? So if we go back and look at our new instance, we're going to see our databases. AdventureWorks. Again, for some reason, SSG didn't work, so we're going to look at that. We got logins, all the logins. If we go to database mail, we would see that. If we go to our jobs, we see we have all of our jobs. We have our alerts. And we have our operator, okay? So it did almost everything that we said that it would do. So we do need to go through and look and see what went wrong here. I'm going to look at least at that SSG database because that was an unusual one, and we're almost out of time. I spent more time on the slides, I guess, than I probably meant to. So we would go look at that, and then of course, if I was going to rerun this without rolling back, I would want to do something like copy Dba Database. The source is my source instance. The destination is my destination instance. My database is SSG. I want backup restore. I want my shared path. And I could even do this to cheat since I already set that. in the hash table, and I'm going to say let's just run that one real quick and see if it errors out, and we can see why. In the meantime, let's flip over to any questions. I'm looking at the Q&A, and let's see if we have anything. No questions at this time. This is the time for that if you're interested. And there's my database.
Randy, we've got a question.
So that's interesting. What it is there's a log file left over on the L drive for that database. So I would need to go delete that log file and then run that command again. So hopefully that was a quick look at dbatools and doing this. But the point is, it does a lot of work. If you were, using T-SQL to build a script to do this manually, you would do things like script out your jobs, and then it uses job IDs and schedule IDs. So you're going to have to make sure that you get rid of some of that because it's going to a new server. You would spend hours and hours building a script to do what this one does.
There's one question on the published tab.
Okay, got it. Actually, I got you. All right, let's see. The question is, sorry if I missed this, what are the minimum rights needed to execute these functions? If I'm running dbatools for my Windows PC under an AD account, this is not being run on the database servers themselves. What's going to matter is your permissions on the SQL server, right? So your local permissions don't matter too much, and I recommend doing it the way you said, by the way. Use your DBA workstation or a DBA tools server, whatever the case may be, to do all these things. Generally speaking, if you find yourself RDPing to the console of a production server often, you probably could reevaluate what you're doing because almost everything can be done remotely. So that's a good question. And the answer is, to do everything that we just did, you're going to want to be a SQL Server sysadmin, local admin on both servers to make sure everything goes the way that it should. Great question. All right, if there are any other questions, now's the time. I'll stick around for a few minutes. We're at 12 o'clock. But would definitely want to answer those. Future webinars. Our March webinar is, I think, going to be fantastic. It's titled Throwdown SSMS versus ADS, SQL Server Management Studio versus Azure Data Studio. And what we are doing, Scott and I, Scott was the senior consultant that introduced me, have made a commitment to each other that for the next 30 days, between today and the next webinar, we are going to attempt to use Azure Data Studio for everything that we do. Because it's one of those things that, something new comes along, and, we've been using SSMS for 15 years, 16 years, right, since SQL Server 2005. And it's kind of like, if you've been around as long as I have, going from 2000 to 2005, we were really married to Enterprise Manager. We use that a lot. I'm like, what's this SQL Server Management Studio thing, right? And we're going through a similar transition, or another example would be when SQL Server 2005 came out also. That was when we first had dynamic management objects, right? So we had to learn the dynamic management object way of doing things. So it's a way to force ourselves to start using Azure Data Studio. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that for 30 days, and then Scott's going to do a webinar and talk about our experience. What are the things that we had to use SSMS for? What are the things we used Azure Data Studio for? What extensions did we have to install? How do we have to configure Azure Data Studio to accomplish certain tasks? So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Jason just put the link for the March webinar to register for that on the chat. It will, of course, be on our website, and if you're on the mailing list, it will get the email. I also sent out a lot of invitations to this via LinkedIn, or if you just saw it in a tweet, go to our website, register your email address so that you get the emails telling you about future webinars or other events. Right now it's all webinar, right? Someday we'll get back to doing live events. Historically, we've done lots of conferences that we've spoken at, SQL Saturday, which you're probably aware of PASS having liquidated, but thanks to Redgate for picking up those assets and committing to keeping SQL Saturday going. I think it's going to be fantastic, of course, once we get through this pandemic. All right, everybody's, oh, one more question. Great. Let's see. What is a good resource to learn more about DBA tools aside from the DBA Tools in a Month of Lunches book? That's actually what I was going to say. Chrissy Lemaire, and I hope I'm saying her name right, is kind of the maintainer for the DBA Tools module. She's the one that started this whole thing off, and of course there's many others that have contributed, but she wrote that book, DBA Tools in a Month of Lunches. So what I would say is that that's a great place to start. Beyond that, just use them, right? One of the things that's great about PowerShell is it's so easy to just explore. Use that get command to see what commands are available. A lot of times what I've done learning DBA tools, and I certainly don't know all of it yet, is whenever I go to do something, I just think, hey, is there a DBA tool command for that? And more often than not, there is. And then, go get help or go to the docs and just play with it. So it's a great question. And again, I would reiterate what I said at the beginning. This is just a small little taste of what DBA tools can do. If you're not convinced to learn PowerShell as a DBA just to use DBA tools, I don't know what else I could do to convince you. But it's super, super powerful. Okay, if you have questions or things that come up after this webinar, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter or just our website. If you send an email through there's a form and it goes to info@SQLSolutionsGroup.com. That'll make its way to myself or one of our other consultants, and we're happy to answer quick questions. If you ask us to get on a Teams meeting with you and help you troubleshoot something, then that's probably going to be billable. But we're always happy to answer questions. And of course, if you have needs for any help in your SQL Server environments, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody for joining. Stay tuned for our more upcoming events. Appreciate you attending. Have a good day, and we'll see you next month.